Hello everyone, welcome to my Grandmaster's Choice. I'm Grandmaster Steven Zierk, and today I'm going to be covering a couple pretty famous opposite side castling attacks. This first game is between one of my favorite players, Grandmaster Alexander Alekhine, and another top player from his era, Frank Marshall. In this first game, I'm going to see how, from a pretty innocuous middle game position, Alekhine cleverly orchestrates opposite side castling in a position where it's far more suitable to him, because his attack arrives much more quickly, and then, again, orchestrates this attack perfectly. So we start out with d4, knight f6, c4, d5. And this is something, especially when I review games that are in the, say, 1500 to 1800 range on Lichess, I see this opening a lot. But it's not quite best. And the reason is that when white takes on d5, black isn't able to recapture with a pawn, which is usually what black wants to do. And that's why, generally speaking, in this position, black wouldn't play knight f6. They'd, if not capture on c4, play e6 or c6. So they can recapture with a pawn. The difference is, in this move order, when white takes on d5, when Alekhine takes on d5, Marshall is forced to recapture with the knight. And this means that white gets some extra central control. Right? Black has no pawns in the center, and white's traded this c pawn for a d pawn, both of which are good news for white. And Alekhine goes for the immediate e4. Another move that's good here to avoid some tactical tricks is actually knight f3. I believe this is what John Bartholomew recommends actually. And e4 is to come shortly, followed by knight c3. With again a very good position for white. White just gets the more comfortable center for free. And that's why this move order, well, it's not going to lose you the game. It's just not best, right? It's not fighting for the center enough. If black tries something to stop e4, white, aside from causing problems with queen b3, white can play knight c3 or even knight bd2, really insisting on getting this e4 move in. Alekhine goes for the immediate e4, which is also good for white. And after knight f6, the reason this move order is a little riskier, maybe a little more double-edged, is that if white goes knight c3, black has this move e5, which does stake some claim in the center. The idea is if white takes, black can take on d1, and either recapture, right, knight takes e4, or if king takes knight g4, in this line, either recapture gives black some good play. So here, white maybe just plays d5 or knight f3, again with a good game. But Alekhine didn't want to allow this, so he played a bit of an unusual move here. Played bishop d3. The idea is to guard the pawn, and now after e5, he can take on e5 without having to worry about this queen trade and the subsequent counterplay. And of course, if black takes on d4, classic trick everyone should know, bishop b5 check, and it's goodbye to black's queen. All the same, Marshall responds correctly by playing e5 anyway. And after takes, knight g4, white's position's a little open. This bishop is a little awkward. That's kind of the price of developing this way. It would rather be on c4. And black will get this e5 pawn back. So after knight f3, knight c6, Alekhine ends up trading these bishops and just says, okay, you can have the pawn back. And so we get to this position. Even though Marshall's recovered the pawn, even though this center is not as monstrous as one with two pawns would be, white still has an extra center pawn, which gives him more influence, and he has this majority on the king side that has the potential to be very powerful. Especially an unopposed center pawn that can advance can really cramp black, for example, on e5. And here Marshall makes a bit of a slip. So Marshall takes on e5 with the queen. Right, this is the more active move. Right? For example, it makes castling extremely inadvisable. And it does mean he has a lot of control over the center of the board. The problem is, when white starts with h3, this knight is kicked back. It turns out that when these pawns move forward, without any pawns to restrain them on black's side, they're going to gain some very useful tempi targeting these pieces. So because of that, say it was a little better to take with the knight. Right, this trade black would be pretty happy to make, and now there's only one piece in the center. This knight can head to good squares. It might go to c6 and d4 at some point, if it's not traded. And all in all, just a little more precise. But after queen takes, Alekhine goes h3, and after knight f6. And now the question is how to play this position. So here, again, white has a strong center. But one thing you'll notice is that white's dark squares are kind of weak, right? This black queen is doing a great job controlling these pawns and these central squares. And all of these pieces that white has in the center, they're all actually focused on controlling the light squares. White would be really happy if, for example, he could play knight f3 here, right? This would take control of these squares, it would kick the queen out, and support this pawn. But seeing as there's no way to do that, he finds a very clever maneuver here to instead enable his pawn advance and actually serve another purpose, which I'll get to in a second. Castling in f4 is not a bad idea. It does mean that black gets some play in the d file because it leaves these squares a little weak too. Black can play queen d4 here, for instance, and get some good active play. That said, this is also a logical maneuver. But we're going to see why what Alekhine did was even better. Because he plays queen d2, and after bishop d7, he plays this very nice move, queen e3. And so this is very good for a couple reasons. First of all, it doesn't just support f4. It stakes a good control over the center in general. Right? It's balanced well with all of white's light square control. But it targets a7. And the reason this is good is it makes it difficult for black to castle queenside, right? If black castles here, white simply grabs a pawn. So this, in a way, this makes it more difficult for black to castle here. And actually, in the game, it induces Marshall to castle kingside right into this pawn storm. And this actually proves to be what decides the game. So best here is insisting on castling queenside, perhaps with queen a5. Right, and then followed by queenside castling. And this way, black can fight for the d-file, and white's pawn storm, it takes a lot of space, but at least it doesn't create any immediate direct threats. Instead, after bishop c6, white castles queenside. And here, this is where black, I'd say, really needs to appreciate the danger, strategically. Now already, if black plays queen a5, white, for instance, has bishop c4. And castling queenside is already problematic. Knight d7, white can throw in knight d5. And if black castles, white can shatter the pawn structure. So generally speaking, black's lost some time, and white can make it difficult for him to do what he should do. That being said, castling kingside is a very serious strategic error. And this is why, this is actually one of the big things that differentiated Marshall, who was a great player, but had terrible scores against 3 world champions, Lasker, Capablanca, and Alekhine. Right? Even though he was one of the best tacticians of the day, he really struggled against them, had very negative scores. And the reason is that they were much better at getting the positions that would reward their tactics than he was. This is an example. This whole maneuver by white, this queen to e3 and queenside castle, has put black in a very dangerous position, which might not be immediately obvious, but was judged well by Alekhine. So white starts with f4, queen back, and e5. And again, you're already seeing the first tempo gained. At the moment this is pinned, but in the near future, right, it's going to target this knight and force another move from black. And you can already kind of see the attack in the works. You can see how, even though the king's not in trouble yet, it will be in the very near future. And meanwhile, right, black would in return, with the opposite side castling, black would like to attack on the queen side. But you can see just how far behind black is compared to white. Right? White started with a pawn on e4, and with free tempi to gain on these pieces. If black's pawn were on b5 and a5, instead of back here, it would be a different story. But we're going to see anything black can do on the queen side is just much too slow. So black goes rook e8. Right? This targets e5, makes f5 more difficult. So white reinforces with rook e1, again covering this pawn. And after rook d8, white goes f5. Queen e7. And now it's a little more obvious that strategically white is definitely the one achieving their goals. Like, black is definitely the one that has some things to worry about. But okay, for the moment, it's not over. Alekhine goes queen g5. Right, just getting out of this pin. Can't take on f6. So getting out of this pin makes these pawn advances a serious threat. And here Marshall blunders. He said it's very tricky to play a position like this. But the best way for black to play was actually to move this queen out of the way. If black goes queen f8, right, it's saving a tempo, as we'll see on the game. And if white takes on f6, which looks very natural, right? It seems to be breaking up black's kingside. First of all, black tactically recovers the piece, taking on e1 and taking on d3. Right, these trades have weakened white's attack. And black's pieces, I mean, this is not so easy to judge during the game, right? This is very easy to say in hindsight, but it would have been more difficult for Marshall to judge while the game was going. Black's pieces cover enough squares, the bishop prevents any rook e8 invasions, and the rook covers d8, so there's no taking in queen d8. And furthermore, this bishop is actually very well placed, restricting this knight. This knight can't join in the attack either. If it could get to e7, it would be a very different story. So concretely, this play, even though, again, it looks a little scary, allowing this pawn to f6 as an extra attacker, this was the best way for Marshall to create some chances. Instead of that, instead of retreating the queen, he decides to play knight d5. And again, pretty natural move, right? Moving the knight out of danger to the most active square, trying to create some activity for black. But it has a pretty simple major downside. And that is that now f6 comes much more quickly. It comes much more quickly. It comes without allowing these trades that would have been so good for black. And it forces queen f8 anyway. So we have the position with queen f8 already. But white's gaining time. And as we're going to see, the attack hits very strongly. Now, again, white's position with these pawns is obviously very strong. But if your opponent plays well, even if they don't play well, even if they blunder, there comes a point where you have to start playing more concretely to actually use your advantage. Right? You have to read out the attack. Sometimes you have to allow some counterplay, as long as you've carefully read out that it's not going to be enough, that it's not going to work. And he goes bishop c4. So this is somewhat committal. It allows this capture on c3. But it creates some very immediate pressure on black that concretely just works out well for white. So Marshall takes on c3, as is logical. And the point is not to take back. This would be some trades which would help black. But the point instead was that white takes on d8. And when black takes back, white now takes on g7. So this is very strong for tactical reasons. Right? Black can't recapture the pawn because the rook is hanging. And it gains another tempo on the queen. Right? We've seen this poor queen be chased all the way back to f8, and now it's still being chased. And furthermore, with these trades, the move e6 now becomes very strong. Right? The knight is out of the way, this rook is off e8. So e6 is simply going to completely break up black's kingside and leave it indefensible. So if black just plays queen e8, white plays e6, we're going to see this is very similar to the game. Before playing that, Marshall throws in this move knight takes a2. So just almost a shot in the dark for some counterplay. Pretty classic Marshall thing to do, and practically speaking, a good way to play this position. Because objectively, white's attack is much too strong. Black can't reasonably expect to hold off this attack. So going for some play of his own is, again, both theoretically, the defense won't be enough, so it's worth creating some offense, and practically, if you go on the offensive, it's much easier for your opponent to mess up. We're going to see that, well, of course he didn't mess up, being a world champion. Alekhine had some chances to mess up this game, thanks to this try. If he takes on a2, the point is, black can go queen c5 check. Well, this position is still winning for white, still very good. Black at least can look for some counterplay, maybe with bishop e4, and so on. So instead of that, plays a clever move. Just plays king b1. Right, saying this knight doesn't matter in the short term, because this attack is completely winning. And this knight on a2, even if I let it live, it's not going to do anything. Right, if knight c3 check, white can take now, and now black has no checks, right? Now there's nothing to worry about here. Anything black can do is much too slow. Queen a3, queen d8. This just loses. So instead of that, Marshall leaves the knight as well for the moment, and plays queen e8. So now, again, white simply continues, e6. Right? Just threatening to win the game on the spot. And again, there's just no way defensively for black to hold this position. If black takes on e6, white takes back, and this battery just ends the game. Or actually, this is even simpler. And black loses everything. There's no good way to defend f7. So Marshall does the one thing he can in this position. Goes again for some tricks, for some counterplay with bishop e4 check. And once again, white has to be a little bit careful. First of all, if white takes the knight now, this would be a real tragedy, because black checkmates. Taking the bishop wins. Black does get to play rook d1. Again, don't walk into mate. But king c2, and after b3. This would beat back the attack. But white plays even more simply. Alekhine simply says, my attack is about to win the game. There's nothing you can do about it. I'm not going to allow you any checks at all. And he just goes king a1. He just leaves the knight here. And ironically, this knight makes things easier for white. This knight actually serves the purpose of a white pawn. If this knight weren't here, black would actually have mate with queen a4 check and rook d1 check. Or black would actually win with these checks. So he says, okay, your knight's doing me a favor here. I'm just going to leave it. And again, the material doesn't matter much, because this is completely crushing. So taking on f7 is an extremely strong threat. Marshall plays f5. The idea that after e7, he goes rook d5. For just the moment, holding off the bishop, creating some defensive play. If white plays a little carelessly and takes on d5, he can at least block with this, although even here, rook d1 is completely winning. Even here, rook d1 ends the game. But of course, Alekhine finds a simpler way. Simply plays queen f6 now, while the bishop is still here. Rook e4 is winning as well. This structure is just much too flimsy. So he plays queen f6. And after queen f7, right, queen f8 would mate, so queen f7. And he queens. And here Marshall resigned, because queen takes e8 is forced, white takes on d5, and he mates. And the attack concludes. And again, you can see how useful this knight was to white, not to black. So a very finely executed attack by Alekhine. And more generally, I also want to mention how clever his play was to induce a good attacking position in the first place. This is one of his trademarks, and it's what led to him getting so many vicious attacks, even in calmer Queen's Gambit decline type positions, even in what seemed like a fairly normal opening position. Because he created a position where attacking was strong, and then attacked very, very well. So a great game from him. And this game, too, is, I think, a great example of why Alekhine was this world champion, was this absolute top player, one of the best ever. And Marshall, as strong as he was, as good a tactician as he was not up to the same level. It's really the good strategy behind the attack, and not just the attack. Yeah, and these pawns were absolute monsters. Alright, so for the second game, I'm going to jump to another one of the strongest players ever. This is a game by Bobby Fischer against another top player of the era, Larsen. These two actually had a very good rivalry. In this game, Fischer opens with his trademark e4. Larsen plays the Sicilian, and we actually go into what was quite popular at the time, even at top level. We go into a dragon. Now, Fischer did not have a ton of respect for the dragon, even in a time when it was played much more. He mentions that the attack he carries out this game, he carried out in a lot of Skittles games, a lot of Blitz games. So we go into one of the main lines, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3. Right, the idea after bishop e3 is if black tries to harass the bishop with knight g4, it fails tactically to bishop b5 check. This is a good dragon tactic to know, whichever color you play, because now if black tries to block the check, white can simply grab the knight. So for the moment, this bishop is safe on e3. Black goes bishop g7, and now white plays f3. Very standard pawn setup in this line. Right, securing e4 and preventing this knight g4 maneuver. And black castles. Again, all of this has been seen a million times. This is the main line. Queen d2. Knight c6. Yeah, dragon's kind of iffy. This is true, although at the time, the dragon was considered to be on much less shaky ground than it is today. This game was actually one of the influences for the dragon's current reputation. And in this position, the most popular move is actually the castle queenside immediately. This does allow, concretely this allows an immediate d5. And there's an ocean of theory here I'm not going to dive into, but suffice to say, practically speaking, it's very dangerous for white if they don't know exactly what they're doing, but objectively, black's standing on somewhat shaky ground. In this game, though, Fischer, as is somewhat his trademark, plays a much more straightforward move, which is the other main line, which is this 9 bishop c4. Right, stopping d5, creating attacking potential on this diagonal, and just preparing to castle queenside anyway. The downside to this move, though, is that black can take, and while black's not getting d5 in, thanks to this bishop, while black's not getting d5 in, black can offer this trade. And if white takes, this pawn structure might look a little funny, but it's perfectly good for black. Black has a lot of central control. This d5 square white's usually so fond of is not usable, and without the light-squared bishop, attacking is much more difficult. So because black doesn't mind this pawn structure, white has to retreat the bishop. And you can kind of see the downside, right? White's lost some moves. Black is countering white's attack on this diagonal. And all in all, this is still a playable position for black. But as we're going to see, it gets into opposite side castling. After queen a5, Fischer castles queenside. Again, this is all well known. And this is where the standard plans come into play. Right? King on the queen side, king on the king side. Standard plan for black is pushing these pawns. Standard plan for white is pushing these pawns. And this is why the dragon has such a sharp reputation. The evaluation really hangs on a thread. So whoever slows down, whoever falls behind in these attacks, can easily end up like Marshall did in the last game. They just get run over. They get run over by the pawn storm. So black goes b5 and b4. So now Fischer goes knight d5. And the question here is, after bishop d5, this is a big moment for black. In this position, black can take on d5 after what white takes back on g7. And here, this middle game is good for white. But black can go knight c3 check. This is a nice in-between move. And after bishop takes c3, even though white wins a pawn here, this endgame is okay for black. This endgame is playable. This is actually one of the reasons that castling is more popular now than bishop c4. Because thanks to these minor piece exchanges, black ends up all right, concretely. But as someone kind of touched on, and black is not playing for a draw, but a win. So Larsen wanted to attack too. He didn't want a position like this. He didn't want an endgame like this. So instead of taking the bishop and simplifying to an endgame, he plays rook c8. And Fischer mentioned he was stunned by this move. Again, he wants to keep the pieces on the board. But, okay, Fischer wastes no time in rescuing this bishop, brings it back to b3. And we're going to see just what a powerful piece this bishop is. Right, as it turns out, empirically, black just can't allow white to keep this piece. Because it serves multiple purposes. So black goes rook c7. You can kind of see, right, it's already stopping a couple of black's most natural attacks. And Fischer begins his own. h4. And as Fischer mentions in my 60 memorable games, I'd won dozens of Skittles games in analogous positions, and I had it down to a science. Pry open the h-file, sack, sack, mate. Yeah, this quote and a few games like this did a lot to tarnish the dragon's reputation. So Larsen goes queen b5. Right, c2 is well defended, so he's looking at a5, a4 as a way to get play. And Fischer continues h5. Yeah, so you can see the attack beginning. Larsen's still in a much better situation, practically speaking. His attack is much further along than Marshall was in the other game. But it's not enough. He's still behind, and you're going to see the consequences. If black takes on h5, black sometimes does this, but it's usually extremely dangerous, including in this position. After bishop takes, king takes, white goes g4, and we're seeing black hasn't won a pawn. Black's just done white a favor opening this h-file. Knight f6, white checks, and g5. This is a pretty classic dragon pattern. A lot of white wins look very similar to this. After knight h5, the simplest way, white actually just crashes through. Sack on h5. Yeah, sack on h5 is one of the most classic things to do in the dragon for white. And after g takes, white can play g6. And now we see the power of this bishop. Right, pinning the f-pawn and making this breakthrough just end the game on the spot. If black takes on g6, white can take, check, and it's mate once the other rook comes in. So all in all, the general conclusion from this line is that it's absolutely foolhardy for black to basically give white any assistance in opening these lines. And Larsen correctly moves the other rook to c8 instead. Not only does this go along with his plan to put pressure on the queen side, right, after a5, a4, c2 can be a very problematic square, but it also gives this queen the important f8 square to escape. So h takes. Right, now we're seeing that because black hasn't taken on h5, black still has this bishop, which controls the h6 square. So white's attack is slower here, and black's attack is faster. So Larsen's at least putting up a good fight. So Fischer goes g4, a5, and g5, right, to induce knight h5 anyway. I mean, so you can see just how good this is for white, given that Fischer is spending all this time just to get black to play it. Right, if the knight moves away, then white just eventually moves the queen to the h-file and crashes through that way. So Larsen goes knight h5, blocking this file. And as you might guess at this point, Fischer goes rook takes h5. Now here, as it turns out, concretely the best defense for black is actually not to take the rook. It's to take this bishop. The bishop's a great defender of h8. It covers a lot of the checkmates. That's part of why white's so eager to trade it off in the dragon. White does trade it off, and after takes g6, this position is extremely dangerous for black. Now, if I saw it in a game, I would probably be convinced that black was just busted. But as it turns out, there's what I'm almost going to call an engine-style move. Black plays rook c4. And this really highlights the power of this bishop. Black would gladly give up in exchange just to cut it out of the attack. So after white takes, problem is this time, white just lacks the material and black's king can run. Again, still not a pretty position. Few people would willingly take black here. But at least this way, white's attacking forces are kept under better control. What's wrong with queen h2 instead of queen takes d4? So if white plays queen h2 instead of queen takes d4, the problem is when black still has this bishop, it's harder to break through. I mean, even if black goes bishop g7, it's hard for white to actually find a mate here when this bishop is here. Right? If this bishop were off the board, rook h8 ends the game, but here it's less clear. And rook here, black can look at taking. Of course, here there is also, actually this would taking the rook would probably be foolhardy, but generally speaking, this bishop is a very powerful defensive piece. And that's why white's so eager to look for this trade. Instead, though, Larsen captures the rook. Okay, thinking rook h7, then rook takes g7. So, let me find it. So, queen h4. It's a decent idea. This is a pretty typical attacking idea. Here, I think, though, black can bring enough defensive forces quickly enough. The queen can potentially replace the bishop. And black does have some threats of their own. It's certainly an idea worth looking at, though. So instead of taking the bishop as he should, Larsen takes the rook. And now we see the power of this bishop. Fischer simply plays g6, and even though he's down in exchange, it's still the most powerful piece on the board. If you remember the previous line where bishop takes d4 was good, it might occur to play rook c4 here. And rook c4, this is a good try from black. The difference, though, here is that white takes on f7, takes on g7, and we actually have the same position with one difference. This king is on g7 instead of f7. And because of that, the white rook joins in with check, and this one extra tempo means the attack is crushing. After king h7, white has queen h6, which threatens mate with queen g6, queen g8. And after, say, king e8, queen e6, black's just getting run over, right? If black keeps trying to run, rook g8 wins everything. Queen here, black will get mated soon. So we see that if black goes for this same idea with rook c4, there's a fatal loss of tempo. Larsen, instead, to keep this bishop, Larsen makes a very committal move, e5. Right, this stops the trade, but on the flip side, it exposes black's king. And right, it means that this bishop is not going to be an active participant for a very long time. And actually, as a third problem, it makes d6 weak because the pawn is no longer on e7. Yeah, it is pretty incredible just how quickly black's position can fall apart once this initial line of defense on h7 or on the h-file breaks down. And Fischer just goes bishop e3. Right? Doesn't look too sharp. But simply speaking, this king is in a very unsteady situation. White's looking at breaking through with queen d6. And white's also looking at simply playing bishop h6. When white's pieces are just going to invade. There are too many lines into the black's position. And you're seeing, again, black's attack. Black's attack is one move away from being serious, actually. a4 targeting the bishop in the c2 square. Black's attack is very close to being serious, unlike Marshall's. But it's still just too slow. It's a move or two too slow, and that's all it takes. Right. Larsen plays d5, trying to cut off support for this pawn. Fischer simply plays e takes. And this would be the moment, if there were one, this would be the moment for a4. Right, the bishop's trapped, but as it turns out, white simply plays d6, takes, and takes c7. And now white's established a material advantage. If black takes on a2, just play king a1. And black's king is still not in a good situation. Not long for the world. Yeah, so this would be the moment to play a4. As you can see, it's close. If black got one more move, it would have worked. But it's not close enough. So Larsen just takes on f7. Trying to contain this attack. Trying to at least say, I have the extra exchange. If I can even give that back, right? If I could give a rook back for this bishop, maybe I could defend that position. So, you know, I've got something going for me. But still, I mean, this is a monster piece, again, offensively and defensively. And you're probably seeing just how bitterly Larsen regrets not trading it. And it's going to win the game. So rook f6 and bishop g5. And the white pieces simply come storming in. Right there simply isn't a good move. If rook g6, white can simply go bishop e7 and d7. Not the only win, but the fastest. Yeah, white's d2 queen and b3 bishop defend the queen side, while black's rooks are horrible for kingside defense. That is true. These have been some very good multi-purpose pieces for white. But the key again really is that, I mean, I've talked a bit. The key really is that Larsen fell behind, right? If black could play this move with the rooks on the c-file, life would be pretty good. Life could even be great for him. It does not take much for white's position instead of black's to be busted in the dragon. But when you're behind on the attack, it just doesn't work. So rook f6, bishop g5. And now white's pieces come swarming in. Right? Black goes back with queen b7 to bring the queen back on the defense. White grabs his material back and plays d7. I mean, this cuts the queen off. Even if it weren't for the attack, right, this is an extra pawn on d7. Even if it weren't for the attack, this would be a completely winning material advantage. And after rook d8, here's a little puzzle for you guys. What is the fastest checkmate for white here? White to play and mate in 3. Fischer played a move that's completely winning, so I can't really criticize it, but he makes a little joke about this in my 60 memorable games, that there was actually a faster win. Right, queen h6 check is the fastest. The point being, if bishop g7, queen c6 is a nice checkmate. And if king e7, queen h7, and the queen makes its way to f7, checkmate. Fischer instead played queen d6. Yeah, don't get me wrong, this is completely winning. Certainly no one in their right mind would call it a mistake. And it was good enough that after queen d6, Larsen actually resigned the game. Because after king g7, white just plays rook h1, king h7, and queen f6. And while white hasn't mated yet, white hasn't mated as quickly as queen h6, it's not difficult to tell that black's king is not long for the world. And of course, black's down a piece. As long as white notices there's a back rank mate threat here. Let's see. Probably the fastest mate is check, check, and mate on g7 after this. Yeah, so a very nice game by Fischer. In this position, Larsen saw what was coming. White's attack crashed through, and Larsen resigned. So all in all, those two games are very good examples of powerful kingside attacks. In the first one, in Alekhine's game, we saw Marshall's attack never really got started. And that's because Alekhine set up a middle game where his pawns were so well suited to attack black. Right, we saw that in this position. Right, we see how much powerful white's attack is when white already has proper control for the pawns, and black's pieces are giving them free tempi as they advance. So part of it, right, part of it's not just executing the attack, but like Alekhine did here, reaching a position where the attack is good, right? Here, white's, we've got opposite side castling attacks, but it's like white got 3 or 4 free moves in the meantime. So very nice strategy by Alekhine, and as we saw, an excellently orchestrated attack. In the Fischer game, things were much closer. We had a typical dragon line. We had a typical dragon line in which Larsen played the logical dragon moves, but he made one big mistake, which was not trading off this bishop, which, like as we saw in the game, is a monster dual-purpose piece that created serious threats against Black's king and completely killed Black's offensive idea. And even with just, basically, I would say, this one major mistake, along with some other defensive possibilities in a bad position, was enough that Larsen just got crushed. So very, very interesting middle game positions and 2 very well executed attacks by 2 of the best players ever. Yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed those games. Thank you all for watching. So anyone have any questions? Larsen also made the mistake of playing the dragon. This is true. Like I said, as a result of this game, and some other ones with similar fates, the opening's reputation took a significant hit. Of course, I will say too, though, it doesn't take white doesn't have to mess up much. If white makes an analogous mistake to Larsen's in this game, you know, a similar mistake, then white can easily just get run over. Right? If, for example, in say a position like this, if black can pull off a4 before white's attack crashes through, then the same thing can happen to white. White can easily end up dead lost. At Manny, I will be on shortly for my second lecture, which is Games of the Week. Actually some very nice attacking wins by Nepo. What do I think with black's lines with h5 in response to h4? I mean, it's complicated. All in all, those lines are extremely sharp, right? Black's in a lot of danger. It's very concrete. You really just have to know in those kinds of lines exactly what you're doing, because white's committing material, and of course black's opening up lines for the attack. So really, it's the kind of position like this game where any kind of error by either side has disastrous consequences. For the second lecture, I will still be here, Nathan. In opposite side castling, is central control important? Yes, central control is extremely important. Because pieces in the center are very good dual-purpose pieces. You know, especially knights, which are kind of slow. A knight in the center of the board can still affect both wings. Central control enables your pieces to do a lot, to influence a lot of the board at once. And actually, if we take a position like this, so let's go to, say, this position. It's not just that white has a kingside attack. With these pawns here, white is badly cramping black's pieces. Right? You can see white's pieces kind of have a free hand to go to the kingside. Everything apart from this knight, which is well controlled by the bishop, has a free hand to play on the kingside. On the same time, black is badly restricted in space thanks to these pawns controlling the central square. Is sacrificing the rook for the knight on c3 normal in these types of positions? So yes, in the dragon, it wasn't so relevant this game. Let me see. It wasn't so relevant this game because by the time black played rook c8, the knight was already gone. But yes, in the dragon, playing rook takes c3 as black to induce b takes is very thematic. It's in all sorts of lines. Sometimes even for the endgame. It can make a very strong attack, but even in the endgame, it can be good compensation, especially with this bishop. Do I have a Twitch stream? Yes, I do. It's actually it's GM Zierk. So GM and then my last name, if you'd like to take a look. Yeah, but those are 2 great games from 2 of my favorite players. I hope you guys enjoyed them. Any other questions? All right, well then, I will see you in a little bit for Games of the Week. Thanks for the compliment, Anon. And I hope you can check out that other lecture. Bye, everyone.